Good morning and good evening, everyone. I want to start by acknowledging that we all go through seasons in life where we find ourselves in what feels like a wilderness. Those times when everything seems dry, barren, and we're uncertain about which way to go. It's in these wilderness moments when we feel isolated, abandoned, or confused that we often ask the most profound question. Where is God in my wilderness? If you're in that wilderness right now, or if you've ever been there, I want to encourage you with this. God has not left you. Just because you can't see him doesn't mean he's not there. In fact, he is closer to you than you might realize. And if you're willing to open your eyes and your heart, you'll see that he is at work in ways that might not be immediately visible. Let's start by remembering that God has a history of showing up in the wilderness. It's in the wilderness that we learn to trust him. It's in the wilderness that he refines us, in the wilderness that he shapes us into who he wants us to be. Take the Israelites, for instance. When they found themselves in the wilderness after being freed from slavery, they had no idea what to expect. They had no map, no GPS, and no clear direction. All they knew was that they were following a cloud by day and a fire by night. And even though they couldn't see the end of their journey, God was with them every step of the way. If you're in a wilderness, don't be discouraged by the uncertainty. Just as God led the Israelites with a cloud and a fire, he will guide you too. It might not always be clear, and you might not always know the next step, but trust this. God is leading you through the wilderness to a place of greater purpose and growth. You see, wilderness seasons are not wasted seasons. Every struggle, every challenge, every moment of doubt has a purpose. God doesn't waste any part of our journey. He is working in the midst of our pain to bring about something greater. He is using this time to shape our character, deepen our faith, and prepare us for what he has ahead. But here's the challenge. When we're in the wilderness, it's easy to feel like God is silent. We pray, but we don't hear anything. We ask for guidance, but it seems like God isn't answering. And in those moments, we might begin to wonder, where is God in all of this? Let me assure you, silence doesn't mean absence. It doesn't mean God is not working. In fact, God often speaks to us most powerfully in the quiet moments of life. Think about how God spoke to Elijah. The Bible tells us that God wasn't in the wind, the earthquake, or the fire, but in the still, small voice. Sometimes God's voice comes to us in the quietest, most unexpected ways. And when we are in the wilderness, it's in those moments of silence that God is teaching us to listen, to trust, and to rest in his presence. I also want to remind you that even in the wilderness, God provides. The Israelites didn't go hungry in the wilderness because God provided manna from heaven. He provided water from a rock. He gave them everything they needed, even when it seemed like there was nothing. He will provide for you too. Maybe you're asking, where is my provision? Maybe you're feeling like there's nothing but dry ground beneath your feet. But let me tell you, God's provision is not always in the form we expect. It might not look like what we thought it would, but if we are faithful to trust him, he will always provide exactly what we need when we need it. Wilderness seasons also bring clarity. When life gets quiet and we're stripped of all the distractions, we start to see things more clearly. We begin to understand what truly matters. The wilderness has a way of showing us what's important and what's not. It teaches us to depend on God alone and not on the things that we once thought would sustain us. So if you're in the wilderness today, don't give up. Don't quit. Don't lose hope. God is there. He is working even when you can't see it. He's shaping you, molding you, preparing you for something greater. The wilderness is not your final destination. It's a season of growth, transformation, and deepening relationship with God. Remember, God doesn't waste anything, not even the wilderness. So while you may feel like you're in a dry place, I want you to know this. God is right there with you, providing, guiding, and making a way. Hold on to that truth today. Where is God in my wilderness? He's right there with you, leading you every step of the way. In times of difficulty, when we feel as though we are walking through a wilderness, one of the most common feelings is abandonment. We find ourselves asking, where is God? Why does it feel like he's distant when I need him the most? It's easy to feel alone when things aren't going our way, when life seems unyielding and when the challenges of the moment seem overwhelming. But in those times, it's important to remember that God is never absent. He is always present, even when we can't see or feel him. The wilderness is often a place of isolation, discomfort, and uncertainty. When we are walking through a tough season, whether it's a financial struggle, a relationship breakdown, a health crisis, or simply the weight of life's burdens, the temptation is to believe that God has abandoned us. But the truth is, God is with us in the wilderness, just as he was with his people throughout history. The Israelites experienced this firsthand when they were led into the wilderness after being freed from slavery in Egypt. They had just witnessed God part the Red Sea, yet there they were facing uncertainty in the desert, wondering where God was. In their desperation, they cried out. And despite their doubts and complaints, God's presence was with them every step of the way. Sometimes God's presence is not always immediately apparent. It doesn't always come in the way we expect. We might be looking for dramatic signs or miraculous interventions, but instead, we might feel only silence or struggle. But this silence does not equate to absence. God's presence is often most profoundly felt when we learn to look beyond our immediate circumstances. In fact, some of the deepest lessons we learn about God come during these times of wilderness. We learn to trust not in our own understanding, but in the fact that God is walking with us, whether we feel his presence or not. Think of the story of the Israelites in the wilderness. Even when they couldn't see God or hear from him in the way they were used to, he was still present. He guided them by a cloud during the day and a fire by night. Even when they questioned his intentions, even when they felt alone, God was still present, leading them every step of the way. God wasn't distant. He was just leading them in a way that required their trust. He asked them to rely on him in the midst of their uncertainty. He wanted them to learn that his presence doesn't always look the way we expect, but that he is always with us, even when it seems like he's not. In the wilderness, God doesn't leave us to fend for ourselves. Instead, he provides, sustains, and teaches. His presence is evident in the ways he meets our needs, in the small moments of comfort, and in the quiet ways he strengthens us. In the midst of the desert, he fed the Israelites with manna from heaven, and he brought water from a rock. Those were tangible signs of his presence. Even in the wilderness, God was not absent. He was at work providing for his people in ways that demonstrated his faithfulness. Moreover, God's presence in the wilderness isn't just about what he does for us, but about who he is. In the wilderness, we have the opportunity to experience God in a deeper way. When everything else is stripped away, when we are removed from the distractions of life and left with only our faith in him, we encounter God in ways that we might not in more comfortable seasons. The wilderness, in a sense, serves as a refining fire, burning away the things that might keep us from recognizing God's presence more fully. Even though we may not always sense his presence in the moment, the Bible assures us that God is always with us. Hebrews 13:5 says, "Never will I leave you, never will I forsake you." These words are a promise that no matter what we face, we are never alone. God's presence is constant, even when it feels like everything around us is uncertain. The wilderness is a place where God teaches us to rely on him and trust in his presence. It is a place where he reveals his faithfulness, even when it's hard to see. And it is a place where he strengthens our faith, drawing us closer to him as we learn to trust that he is with us, even when the way forward seems unclear. We may not always feel his presence, but he is always near, working in ways we may not fully understand, yet always faithful to his promises. Wilderness seasons are not just times of hardship. They are also times of growth. God uses the wilderness to shape and refine us in ways that we can't always understand at the moment. These seasons, though painful and difficult, are part of God's purpose for our lives. In the wilderness, God is not punishing us or leaving us to suffer alone. Instead, he is molding our character, building our faith, and preparing us for the next chapter in his plan. When the Israelites wandered through the desert for 40 years, they didn't know what was ahead. They didn't understand why they were there or how long they would have to endure. Yet, it was in the wilderness that God taught them vital lessons about dependence on him. They learned that their survival didn't depend on their own strength, but on God's provision. Every day they were given manna from heaven and water from a rock, things that they could never have provided for themselves. Through these miracles, God taught them to trust in his ability to meet their needs, even when it seemed impossible. The wilderness is often a place where God breaks us down in order to build us up. It's where we are stripped of our self-reliance and forced to depend on God in ways we might not have done before. And while that process is uncomfortable, it is essential for our growth. Think about the process of refining gold. It must be put through the fire to remove impurities. Similarly, God allows us to go through difficult seasons to refine us, to remove the things that hinder our spiritual growth, and to make us more like Him. It's easy to view the wilderness as a place of punishment or abandonment, but in reality, it's a place of preparation. God uses the wilderness to teach us patience, perseverance, and faith. It is in these seasons that we learn to trust Him more deeply, even when we can't see the end of the journey. We learn to rely on His timing rather than our own. We learn that His plans are better than our own, even when we don't understand them. God doesn't waste any part of our journey, even the most difficult seasons. The wilderness is where He works in us, refining our hearts and transforming our minds. It's where He teaches us to listen to His voice and follow His lead. The wilderness is where God prepares us for something greater, something beyond what we can imagine. But we can only experience that growth if we remain faithful and continue to trust Him, even when it's hard. We also need to understand that the wilderness is not permanent. It is a season, not a destination. The Israelites did not stay in the wilderness forever. There was a promised land waiting for them, a place of rest, peace, and abundance. In the same way, our wilderness seasons are not permanent. They are a part of our journey, but they are not where God wants us to remain. God has a plan for our lives, and that plan involves moving us from the wilderness to a place of blessing and fulfillment. However, we must also recognize that the wilderness is necessary for the fulfillment of God's promises. If the Israelites had entered the promised land too early, they would not have been ready to fully embrace and enjoy the blessings that God had for them. The wilderness was a time of testing, preparation, and transformation. It was the process that allowed them to enter the promised land with the faith and maturity they needed to thrive there. Similarly, God uses the wilderness in our lives to prepare us for the future He has in store for us. In the wilderness, God teaches us to trust His plan even when we don't understand it. He shows us that His timing is perfect and that His ways are higher than our ways. And while we may not enjoy the process, we can trust that God is always working in us, even when we can't see the results. The wilderness is a place of refining, but it is also a place of It's where God shapes us into the people He wants us to be, and it's where He prepares us for the blessings that are ahead. When we walk through the wilderness with God, we are not just surviving, we are growing, becoming more resilient, and learning to trust Him more deeply. The wilderness may be a hard place, but it is also a sacred place where God does some of His most powerful work in our lives. It is a place where our faith is tested, refined, and strengthened. And when we come out of the wilderness, we are not the same. We are stronger, more faithful, and more prepared to embrace the good things that God has in store for us. In the wilderness, it's often easy to feel like God is silent. We pray for guidance, for direction, for answers, but it seems as though nothing is happening. The heavens feel like brass, and the silence is deafening. In these moments, we may begin to question whether God is even listening or whether He is distant and uninterested in our struggles. But silence does not mean absence. Just because we don't hear God's voice in the way we expect doesn't mean that He isn't working on our behalf. In fact, God often speaks most clearly in the quiet moments of life. We have to understand that God's ways are different from ours. When we are in the wilderness, we often want immediate answers, quick fixes, and clear signs. But God's timing is different. He doesn't always answer us in the moment we want. Sometimes He allows us to sit in silence because He's doing something in us that requires patience, trust, and faith. God doesn't speak in ways we can always predict or control. Sometimes He speaks in the stillness, in the silence, and in the spaces between the words. Think about the prophet Elijah. He found himself in a moment of despair, feeling alone and abandoned. He went into the wilderness, seeking answers from God. When God called him to the mountain, there were dramatic events, a strong wind, an earthquake, and a fire. But God was not in any of these powerful displays. Instead, God spoke to Elijah in a still small voice. This quiet, gentle whisper was where God's presence was most clearly felt. It wasn't in the dramatic or the obvious, but in the subtle and the gentle. Similarly, in our wilderness experiences, we might be looking for God in the loud moments, in the dramatic signs, but God might be speaking in the quiet, in the spaces between our cries. The wilderness teaches us to listen more closely, to hear God in the stillness, and to trust that He is there even when we don't immediately sense His presence. Sometimes the silence is a part of the process. God is teaching us to wait on Him, to listen more intently, and to trust that His timing is perfect. There is also something deeply important about the silence that we experience in the wilderness. In the quiet moments, God invites us to rest. He calls us to slow down and reflect, to disconnect from the noise and distractions of life so that we can hear Him more clearly. Silence creates space for reflection, for growth, and for deeper intimacy with God. It's in these moments that we are reminded that God is not only in the loud, extraordinary moments, but He is also present in the quiet, ordinary ones. When we are in the wilderness and we feel that God is silent, it's important to remember that God is still at work. Just because we don't see or hear the immediate results doesn't mean He's not moving. Silence doesn't mean God has abandoned us. It means He's giving us space to trust Him more deeply. It's in these times that God is shaping our faith, teaching us to rely on Him even when we can't see the path ahead. The wilderness also reminds us that God's silence is not a sign of rejection, but of refinement. There are times when God doesn't speak directly because He wants us to learn to walk by faith, not by sight. He wants us to trust Him even when we can't hear His voice clearly. He wants us to lean on His word, to rely on His promises, and to believe that He is still with us, even in the quiet moments. It's in the silence that we often discover a deeper sense of God's presence. When we are stripped of the noise and distractions, we are forced to confront the deeper questions of our hearts. We may not get all the answers we want, but we gain a deeper understanding of who God is and how He works in our lives. God's silence in the wilderness becomes an invitation to deepen our relationship with Him, to trust in His goodness even when we can't see it, and to believe that He is always near even when we don't hear His voice. In the wilderness, one of the most crucial truths we must hold on to is that God provides even when it seems like there's nothing. When life feels barren and empty, when we feel like we're walking through a desert with no hope of relief, God's provision becomes a lifeline. The wilderness is not a place where God abandons us. It's the very place where He shows up with unexpected provision. The Israelites experienced this firsthand during their 40 years in the wilderness. They had been freed from slavery in Egypt, but their journey through the desert was long and uncertain. They didn't have the resources they needed to survive, and they had no idea where their next meal would come from. But God provided for them every step of the way. He sent manna from heaven to feed them, and when they were thirsty, He provided water from a rock. Even in the dry and barren wilderness, God's provision was evident. It didn't always come in the way they expected, but it was always just what they needed when they needed it. When we find ourselves in the wilderness, it's easy to become overwhelmed by what we lack. We might focus on the things we don't have, money, stability, relationships, and feel as though we're running on empty. But the truth is, God's provision isn't limited to what we think we need. It often comes in ways we don't expect. Just as He provided manna in the wilderness, God's provision for us might look different from what we imagined. Sometimes it's not about material needs, but about the emotional, spiritual, and relational resources we need to keep going. God's provision isn't always immediate or in the form we want, but it is always enough. In the wilderness, the Israelites learned to trust that God would provide for them each day. They were not given a year's supply of manna all at once. They were given just enough for each day. This daily provision taught them to rely on God and to trust that He would meet their needs one day at a time. In the same way, God may not give us everything we want or everything we think we need, but He promises to provide for us in ways that are sufficient for the journey. Another aspect of God's provision in the wilderness is that it often requires us to step out in faith. The Israelites didn't always understand how God would provide, but they had to trust that He would. When they were thirsty and there was no water in sight, they had to trust that God would bring water from a rock. When they were hungry, they had to trust that God would provide manna. Sometimes the provision doesn't come in the way we expect, and we must take a step of faith, trusting that God will provide exactly what we need when we need it. In the wilderness, God also teaches us the value of contentment. When we're in a place of scarcity, it's easy to feel discontented and to focus on what we don't have. But God's provision in the wilderness teaches us to be grateful for what we do have. The Israelites learned to rely on God for their daily needs, and they learned to appreciate the provision that came even when it wasn't what they expected. In our own wilderness seasons, we are called to be content with what God has given us, trusting that He knows what we need and when we need it. Moreover, God's provision is a reminder of His faithfulness. Even when we feel like we are walking through a desert, we can be assured that God is with us, providing for us in ways we might not immediately see. He is faithful to meet our needs, even when the way forward seems uncertain. God's provision in the wilderness is not just about providing food or water. It's a testimony to His ongoing presence and care for us. When we feel like we are running on empty, we can trust that God will provide for us, just as He did for the Israelites in the wilderness. His provision might not always look like what we want, but it will always be enough. He will provide the strength, the encouragement, the wisdom, and the resources we need to keep moving forward. In the wilderness, we may not see the end of the journey, but we can trust that God's provision will sustain us every step of the way. His provision is a tangible reminder that He is with us, that He cares for us, and that He will never leave us without what we need to fulfill His purpose for our lives. The wilderness has a unique way of clarifying what truly matters in life. When we find ourselves in the midst of hardship, stripped of the comforts and distractions of daily life, we are forced to confront what we really value and need. In the wilderness, God often removes the things that have become idols or distractions, revealing what is essential and what is not. This process is uncomfortable, but it is also transformative, as it helps us refocus on what truly matters, our relationship with God, our faith, and our dependence on His provision. When everything around us seems uncertain, when we can no longer rely on our usual sources of strength or security, we start to realize that the things we thought we needed to survive may not be as essential as we once believed. The wilderness challenges us to reassess our priorities. We may have once relied on material possessions, success, or the approval of others to define our worth. But in the wilderness, these things are often stripped away, leaving us with the realization that only God and His promises can truly sustain us. For example, consider the Israelites' journey through the desert. When they first left Egypt, they were overwhelmed by the uncertainty of their situation. They complained about the lack of food, the lack of water, and the difficulty of their circumstances. But as they spent more time in the wilderness, they were forced to shift their focus. They learned that their survival didn't depend on material things. It depended on God's provision and presence. Through their experiences in the wilderness, they came to understand that God was the one who sustained them, not their circumstances. Their relationship with Him became the central focus of their journey. Similarly, in our own wilderness seasons, God often uses the stripping away of external comforts to draw us closer to Him. We may find ourselves relying less on our own strength and more on His grace. We realize that our identity is not found in our achievements, possessions, or the opinions of others, but in who we are in Christ. The wilderness forces us to confront our dependency on God and to reorder our priorities in light of His eternal purposes. The wilderness also teaches us the importance of spiritual disciplines. In the absence of distractions, we are more inclined to turn to God through prayer, worship, and the reading of Scripture. These spiritual practices become a lifeline in the wilderness, helping us stay grounded in God's truth and reminding us of His promises. In times of hardship, we often find that our connection with God deepens. We begin to understand that the things of this world are fleeting, but our relationship with God is eternal. The wilderness helps us to focus on the things that truly matter: our faith, our character, and our trust in God's goodness. Moreover, the wilderness shows us the value of community. While it may feel like we are isolated in our struggles, God often uses these difficult times to remind us that we are not meant to journey alone. The Israelites traveled through the wilderness as a community, and their experience in the desert was meant to bring them closer together as they depended on God's provision and guidance. In our own wilderness seasons, we are called to lean on one another for support and encouragement. The wilderness clarifies the importance of community as we realize that we need others to help us through the hard times. As we learn to focus on what truly matters in the wilderness, we also begin to recognize the things that are less important. The constant striving for success, the pursuit of material wealth, and the desire for approval from others fade into the background as we realize that only our relationship with God has eternal significance. The wilderness clarifies that life is about more than what we own, what we achieve, or how others perceive us. It's about our faith, our character, and our trust in God's sovereignty. The wilderness has a way of removing the distractions that keep us from seeing the truth. It exposes the things we hold on to for comfort or security, and it calls us to let go of anything that takes precedence over our relationship with God. It's a time for purification, for reflection, and for recalibrating our hearts toward God's priorities. In the wilderness, we are reminded that God alone is our source of life and strength, and that everything else pales in comparison to His presence and His purpose for our lives. Ultimately, the wilderness serves as a spiritual sharpening tool, helping us refocus on what truly matters, a deep, abiding relationship with God. It teaches us to seek first His kingdom and His righteousness, knowing that everything else will fall into place. As we walk through the wilderness, we gain clarity about our priorities, our purpose, and the things that truly give life. It's in the wilderness that we often learn to let go of what is temporary and embrace what is eternal. The wilderness is not the final destination. It is a place where we are shaped, refined, and prepared for what lies ahead. Though the wilderness can feel like an endless stretch of uncertainty and struggle, it is important to remember that this season is temporary. The wilderness is a journey, not a place of permanent residence. It may feel like we're stuck in a cycle of hardship, but God is always working, even in the most difficult of times, and He has a purpose for our lives that extends beyond this season. For the Israelites, the wilderness was a necessary part of their journey. They were not meant to stay there forever. They were headed toward the promised land, a place of rest, abundance, and fulfillment. However, before they could enter the promised land, they needed to be prepared. They had to learn to trust God, to rely on His provision, and to understand His ways. The wilderness was where they were tested, refined, and made ready to enter into the blessing that God had for them. The same is true for us. We may be in a wilderness season, but God is preparing us for something greater. Our current struggles are not the end of the story. They are part of the process of getting us ready for the future that God has planned. It's easy to get discouraged in the wilderness, especially when it feels like the end is nowhere in sight. But we must hold on to the truth that God has a purpose for every season of our lives. The wilderness is not a place where we are abandoned or forgotten. It's where God is actively working in us, teaching us to trust Him, to grow in our faith, and to rely on His strength. And as difficult as the wilderness may be, it is not the final destination. God is leading us to a place of promise and fulfillment, just as He led the Israelites to the promised land. Even in the wilderness, God is faithful to fulfill His promises. The Israelites faced many challenges, but God never abandoned them. He provided for them, guided them, and protected them throughout their journey. Similarly, even when we feel like we're stuck in the wilderness, we can trust that God is still faithful. He has promised to never leave us or forsake us. His presence is with us, and He is working in us even when we can't see the end of the journey. The wilderness is also a time of preparation. It is in the wilderness that God often prepares us for the next season of our lives. We may not understand why we are going through certain struggles, but God is using those challenges to build our character, deepen our faith, and refine our hearts. The wilderness is not wasted time. It is where God works in us to shape us into the people He wants us to be. And when we come out of the wilderness, we will be stronger, wiser, and more equipped to handle the blessings He has in store for us. Ultimately, the wilderness is not a permanent destination, but a season that leads us to greater things. The challenges we face in the wilderness are temporary, but the lessons we learn and the growth we experience are eternal. The wilderness may feel like a dry, desolate place, but it is not the end. God is leading us towards something better, something greater than we could imagine. As we walk through the wilderness, we must keep our eyes on the future and trust that God is faithful to complete the work He has started in us. Though the wilderness may seem long and difficult, we can be assured that it is not our final destination. The wilderness is a season of preparation, growth, and transformation, and it is leading us to a place of promise, fulfillment, and abundant life. And when we emerge from the wilderness, we will be able to look back and see that God has been with us every step of the way, preparing us for the blessings that lie ahead.